大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。今天要说的这个人，是人类历史上最伟大的作曲家之一。他的故事里有愤怒，有孤独，有绝望，也有最燃烧的意志力。他在完全听不见声音的情况下，写出了让整个人类震撼的第九交响曲。他就是路德维希范贝多芬。很多人以为贝多芬只是古典乐教科书里的一个大名字，但当你真正走进他的一生，你会发现那根本不是一个旋律家的故事，那是一个人用尽全部力气跟命运硬汉的故事，那是一个在最黑暗的地方还是点燃了火的故事。我想从一个细节开始说起。1824年，维也纳一个剧院，贝多芬站在台上，背对着观众，面向乐团。第九交响曲正在演奏，乐声震动着整个大厅，观众已经激动到快要压不住自己。但是台上那个男人听不见任何声音，一个音符都听不见。他在完全的静默中，跟着脑海里的旋律挥动左手。当最后一个音符结束，观众站起来了，掌声、欢呼声，手帕和帽子在空中飞舞，但贝多芬还是背对着他们。旁边的独唱者轻轻拉了他的袖子，把他转过身来。他转过去，他看见了，他看见整个维也纳起立为他鼓掌，看见人们流着泪为他喝彩。他看见了，但他听不见。这个画面，我每次想到都觉得心里有一种说不出来的感觉。那是悲剧吗？那是胜利吗？那两种东西好像同时都在那个瞬间里。一个用听不见的耳朵写出了人类最伟大声音的人，就这样站在那里，沉默地接受着他永远无法真正听见的荣耀。要理解这个画面有多震撼，我们要从头说起。从1770年说起。贝多芬出生在1770年12月，德国波昂。那个时候的波昂是克隆选帝侯的宫廷所在地，一个有文化、有贵族气息的城市。他家住在莱茵河附近一栋不算宽裕的屋子里，家里有爸爸，有妈妈，有几个兄弟。表面上看，这就是个普通的旋律家家庭。父亲约翰是宫廷的次高音歌手，说好听点是宫廷歌手，说白了就是一个有点才气但更爱喝酒的男人。约翰的人生并不顺遂，他的旋律事业始终停留在中等水准，没有办法往上突破。但他有一个儿子，这个儿子对旋律有一种不寻常的感知能力。他听到了莫扎特的故事，听说神童5岁就能作曲，听说神童的父亲因此功成名就。一个念头在约翰心里点燃了，他要把自己的儿子也打造成一个神童。于是小路德维希的童年是在琴键和恐惧之间长大的。父亲有时候半夜把他从睡梦中拖起来，逼他练琴，练不好就有后果，不是温和的后果。5岁开始接受正式训练，7岁就要公开演出。那场7岁的演出，海报上写的是6岁。父亲把他的年龄改小了1岁，要让他看起来更像神童。这个细节每次让我想到都觉得心疼。一个孩子还没有办法说不，就已经被套上了别人的梦想。但故事从来不只有一面。也正是这种高压的环境，让贝多芬从小就磨出了某种东西。那是一种在压力下不垮的能力，一种就算痛苦也要继续的惯性。他一开始弹琴不是因为快乐，他是因为不但就有后果才拼命练。但慢慢的，他爱上了旋律本身。那个爱是他自己的，是他从父亲的压迫里偷来的，然后紧紧握在自己手里的。11岁，他成为宫廷剧院的助理管风琴师。对一个11岁的孩子来说，这已经是非常了不起的成就。13岁，他在宫廷的乐队里演奏大键琴。他的演奏方式开始显现出一种与众不同的特质。那不是那种让人觉得精致好听的演奏，那是一种让人坐立难安，听完说不出话的演奏。17岁，他有机会去维也纳，那是整个欧洲最重要的旋律城市。关于这次他是否真的见到了莫扎特，历史上没有确切的文字记载，但流传下来的故事说，莫扎特听到他即兴演奏之后，转身对旁边的人说了一句话，大意是，请各位记住这个年轻人，有一天他会让世界震惊。 不管这个说法是否被后人美化，它道出了一个现实，就连那个时代最顶尖的人物，也已经感受到了贝多芬身上那种难以压制的力量。但第一次的维也纳之行没有持续太久，母亲病危的消息传来，他赶回波昂，母亲很快就去世了。父亲越喝越厉害，完全失去了管理家庭的能力。贝多芬这个17岁的少年开始承担起一家之主的责任，他要养2个弟弟，要管家里的账，要在父亲烂醉的时候确保一切还能运转。这是他和现实的第一次正面对撞，那一撞得相当重。1792年，他22岁，再次来到维也纳。这一次是有计划的，他要跟海顿学习，要在这个城市扎根，要成为他应该成为的那个人。维也纳当时就是整个欧洲的旋律首都，最好的作曲家，最挑剔的听众，最丰富的旋律环境，全部集中在这里。贝多芬知道，如果要打这场仗，这里才是真正的战场。他跟海顿学习的过程并不完全顺畅，2个人个性差太多了。海顿温和、工整，重视礼仪和形式；贝多芬粗糙、直接，从来不掩饰自己的想法。他觉得海顿太保守，私下另外找了老师补课。海顿后来知道了，但并没有大发雷霆，因为他清楚地看见，这个学生的才气已经不是传统方式能够框住的了。贝多芬在维也纳很快就建立起了名声，但那个名声不是那种让人说他技巧精湛的名声，那是一种让人说不清楚是什么感受，但是听完之后就忘不掉的名声。他弹琴的时候，力道、速度、情绪的控制，都和当时的流行风格格格不入。那个年代的演奏崇尚典雅、克制、优美，贝多芬带来的是另一种东西，那是一种几乎要把钢琴弹破的激情，一种让听众不知道该如何反应，却又不敢移开耳朵的冲击。他很快就吸引了贵族的注意，里希诺夫斯基亲王成了他最重要的赞助人之一。亲王让他住进宫殿，提供稳定的资助，让他能够专心创作。还有几位其他的贵族轮流在财务上支持他。贝多芬需要这些支援，但他从来不是一个对金主感恩戴德的艺术家。有一次，他和里希诺夫斯基发生了激烈的冲突。事情的起因是亲王要求他为到访的法国军官演奏，他拒绝了。2个人大吵一架。贝多芬说了一句后来被引用无数次的话，大意是这样的，他说，你成为亲王，是因为你出生在那个家庭，而我成为我，是靠我自己。像你这样的亲王，世界上有很多，但像我这样的人，只有一个。说完这些话，他搬出了宫殿。这种骄傲，有时候让人觉得他太难相处，但也正是这种骄傲，让他在创作上从来不肯妥协。他拒绝写那些让贵族觉得舒服但没有灵魂的旋律，他要写的是真正有分量的东西。就在他创作力最旺盛的那几年，灾难悄悄靠近了。大约在他25岁到28岁之间，他开始注意到一个问题，他的耳朵听不清楚了。一开始是耳鸣，接着是高音频的声音变得模糊，然后是整体听力的持续下降。他去看了很多医生，没有人能给他一个令人安心的答案。他尝试了各种方法，温泉疗养、草药，各种当时流行的偏方，全都没有用。对一个作曲家来说，失去听觉是可以想象到的最残酷的剥夺。贝多芬没有办法接受这件事，他开始越来越回避社交，因为他害怕别人发现他听不清楚。如果有人从远处对他说话，他有时候听不到，别人可能以为他傲慢或无礼。他没有办法解释，因为解释就等于承认。在外面他维持着正常的样子，但内心已经在某种地狱里了。1802年，他在海利根施塔特这个地方休养。他写了一封信，写给他的2个弟弟卡尔和约翰。那封信后来被称为海利根施塔特遗书。他在那封信里说，他无法忍受别人看见他的处境，无法忍受那种社交上的孤立和羞辱。他说，他已经非常接近结束自己生命的念头了，是艺术让他停下来。他说， 我没有办法在把我心里所有东西都献给这个世界之前就离开。他还说，他觉得自己才刚要开始。那封信他写完之后没有寄出去，他把它折起来收进抽屉，一个人继续走下去。那一年他32岁，往后他继续创作，而且他创作出的东西越来越伟大。1804年第3号交响曲完成，后来被称为英雄交响曲。那首曲子是交响曲历史上的一个分水岭。在它之前，交响曲大约演奏25分钟，规模有限，风格优雅平衡。英雄交响曲长达将近1小时，结构复杂，情绪从悲壮到崇高，彻底改变了大家对交响曲可以是什么的想象。首演的时候，有人完全震惊，也有人当场离席，说它太长、太吵、太难懂。但也有人说，他们从来没有听过这样的东西。这首曲子原本是要题献给拿破仑的。贝多芬曾经非常崇拜拿破仑，觉得他代表了一种新的理想，代表了自由、平等、对旧秩序的打破。但当拿破仑宣布称帝的消息传到维也纳，贝多芬愤怒地撕掉了题词页。他气愤地说，大意是，拿破仑只是个普通人，他只是为了满足自己的野心，就要践踏人类的一切。他后来把这首曲子重新题献给一位去世的英雄，让它成为对理想本身的悼念，而不是对某个具体人物的赞美。1808年第5号交响曲首演，那个开头4个音，短短短长，全世界几乎所有人一听就认识，就算他们叫不出曲名。贝多芬说，这是命运在敲门。不管这个说法是他本人说的还是后人加工的，那4个音确实传递出了某种非常明确的感受。那是一种不肯让步的紧张，一种在强大压力下还是要继续向前的力量。那也可能是贝多芬和他自己的命运之间那种每天都在发生的拉扯。同一年，第6号交响曲田园也首演了。那首曲子和第5号完全不同，温柔、平静，充满了大自然的气息。贝多芬非常喜欢在乡间散步，他说，大自然给他灵感，给他一种在城市里找不到的清醒。有人说，他的听力一天天在消失，但他从自然里感受到的是另一种超越耳朵的声音。他的听力继续恶化，大约从40岁之后，他几乎完全听不见外部的声音了。他和别人沟通，开始要靠笔记本。有人跟他说话，他就把笔记本递出去，让对方把话写在上面。那些笔记本后来被保存了下来，被历史学家称为对话笔记本。学者通过那些纸页，试着拼凑他晚年的生活样貌。他试着在钢琴上凿掉琴脚，把琴放在地板上，直接把耳朵贴在琴身上感受震动。有记载说，他用一根木棒，一端抵着钢琴共鸣箱，另一端咬在嘴里，用骨传导去感受那些他的耳朵再也听不见的旋律。那个画面每次想起来都觉得有一种说不清楚的悲壮。他在用所有剩下的感官拼命去抓住那些正在消失的声音，但他没有停止创作。他继续写，继续改，继续和旋律在脑海里对话。有一种说法是，在完全失聪之后，他的作曲反而进入了一种更自由的状态，因为他不再受到外部声音环境的干扰，所有的旋律都只存在于他的内心世界。那是一种纯粹到极致的创作状态，那种纯粹，普通的作曲家永远无法达到。1817年，他开始认真构思第9号交响曲。那个想法在他脑子里其实已经放了很多年。他很早就想到要用席勒的诗歌，把人声合唱加入交响曲的最终乐章。但这个想法要真正实现，需要时间，需要力气，需要他把每一个细节都在脑海里磨到刚好。这个工程花了他将近7年的时间。1824年5月7日，第9号交响曲在维也纳首演。那个晚上发生的事，后来成为旋律史上最被反复描述的时刻之一。贝多芬站在台上，站在真正的指挥旁边。他在技术上不是那晚的指挥，因为他已经完全听不见了。但他坚持要站在台上，跟着自己记忆中的旋律翻动着乐谱，比划着身体。曲子演奏的时候，他的动作有时候和真实的演奏是不同步的， 因为他跟着的是他心里那个版本。第4乐章开始，合唱加入了。那段文字来自席勒的诗，用中文来说，那首诗说的是，所有人都要拥抱彼此，所有人都是兄弟，喜悦是一道光，照亮了这个世界。但是台上那个写出这首曲子的人，听不见这些话，听不见这些旋律。曲子结束了，观众爆发出巨大的反应，但贝多芬还是背对着他们，继续翻着乐谱，因为他没有听到那个结束，他不知道演奏已经停了。独唱者之一，一个叫做卡罗琳·翁格尔的女高音，轻轻拉了他的袖子，他引导他转过身来。他转过身，他看见了，他看见的是整个维也纳起立。他看见手帕在空中挥舞，看见人们脱下帽子高举，看见脸上的泪水，看见嘴型在喊叫，看见那种无法压制的激动。他看见了这一切，但他听不见任何声音。据说那一刻，他哭了。我不知道他当时心里在想什么，没有人知道。但我想，那可能是这个世界上最复杂的一种感受，是一种你等了一辈子，用尽了全部力气，牺牲了几乎所有东西，才站到了那个位置。然后你站到了那里，你看见了你想看见的一切，但你听不见那个声音。那首第9号交响曲后来成为了一种超越旋律本身的存在。它的第4乐章那段合唱后来成为欧洲联盟的官方旋律，它被发射到太空，让宇宙也有机会接触这段旋律。它在世界各地的重要场合被演奏，象征着人类最高的渴望，对和平，对兄弟情谊，对超越痛苦之后的喜悦。但那一切是后来的事。在那个首演的夜晚，那个站在台上背对着掌声的男人，只是一个听不见的作曲家，在沉默里完成了他这辈子最重要的任务。我们再说说贝多芬这个人本身，因为他不只是他的旋律，他这一辈子爱过几个女人，但每一段都没有走到最后。有人说是因为他的个性太难相处，有人说是因为他的社会地位始终没有达到那些家庭期待的水准，有人说是因为他根本不懂得怎么在关系里待着。真正的原因可能是这3种混在一起。他死后，人们在他的抽屉里发现了那封信，写给他称为不朽的爱人的女性。那封信从来没有被寄出去，里面的文字充满了激情，充满了渴望，也充满了一种说不清楚是什么的痛苦。那位女性是谁？历史学家争论了快200年，到现在还没有定论。那个谜，也许就让它是个谜吧。他收养了侄子卡尔，侄子是他去世的弟弟卡斯帕尔的儿子。他试着扮演一个父亲的角色，但那段关系非常复杂。他对卡尔的控制欲很强，不允许卡尔的母亲过多介入，不允许卡尔有太多自己的空间。卡尔后来尝试了自杀，虽然没有成功，但那件事让贝多芬受到了很大的打击。也许他始终没有学会怎么用轻盈的方式去爱一个人。他晚年的健康状况很差，除了听力的问题，他的肝脏也出现了严重的问题，肠胃也一直不好。但他还是继续工作，继续写，一直到身体再也撑不住的那一天。1827年3月26日，贝多芬在维也纳去世，享年56岁。那天下午，维也纳的天空传来一声雷，有记载说闪电划过了城市的上空。也许那是他走的方式，轰轰烈烈，符合他这个人。他的葬礼据说聚集了超过2万名维也纳市民。舒伯特，他的后辈，也在那天的送行人群中。维也纳人知道，他们失去了一个无法复制的人。贝多芬一生留下了庞大的旋律遗产，9首交响曲，每一首都是里程碑；5首钢琴协奏曲，第5首皇帝至今仍是钢琴文献中的高峰之作；1首小提琴协奏曲，也是这个乐器最重要的协奏曲之一；32首钢琴奏鸣曲，其中月光奏鸣曲、悲怆奏鸣曲、热情奏鸣曲，几乎每个学钢琴的人都知道；16首弦乐4重奏，尤其是他晚期的几首，深邃到让无数演奏者和听众用一辈子的时间去理解。还有他的唯一1首歌剧《费德里奥》，1首庄严弥撒，以及数不清的其他作品。这些不只是音符的集合， 每一首里面都装着一个人和命运搏斗的痕迹，都装着一个在黑暗里还是要点燃什么的意志。贝多芬的故事之所以让人无法忽视，不只是因为他的才气，才气有很多，历史上有才气的人数不清。他的故事让人无法忽视，是因为他在最不应该继续的时候继续了，是因为他在命运最刻薄的时候给出了最伟大的东西。如果你今天也觉得人生给了你太重的一拳，如果你也正在某个低谷里，不知道怎么继续往前走，就想想那个站在台上听不见掌声的男人。他没有放弃，他不是因为条件够好才继续，他是在条件最烂的时候选择了继续。这就是贝多芬，这就是命运交响曲真正在说的那件事。不是命运在敲门，是他在敲命运的门，敲到命运让开为止。今天的沉思者 J， 我们向这位伟大的巨人致敬。感谢你收看，我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I am Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. Today I want to tell you about one of the greatest composers in all of human history. His story holds fury, loneliness, despair, and the most burning willpower you can imagine. He wrote his Ninth Symphony while completely deaf, unable to hear a single note of it with his own ears. His name was Ludwig van Beethoven. Many people think of Beethoven simply as a famous name inside a classical music textbook, a name you encounter in school and then move on from. But when you truly step inside his life, you realize this is not really a story about a musician at all. This is a story about a human being who spent every last ounce of his strength fighting against fate. This is a story about someone who lit a fire even in the darkest place, and refused to let it go out. There is a particular kind of person who appears in history every few generations. Someone whose relationship with their own life is so uncompromising, so raw, so driven by something almost violent in its intensity, that the work they leave behind carries a different kind of weight than anything else around it. Beethoven was one of those people. And his story begins long before the applause, long before the symphonies, long before any of the fame. It begins in pain, and in pressure, and in a childhood that would have broken most people before they ever had a chance to begin. I want to start with one specific moment, though, because it is the image I want you to carry in your mind as we travel through his life together. The year was 1824. The city was Vienna. Inside a theater, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Beethoven stood on stage, his back to the audience, facing the orchestra. The Ninth Symphony was being performed for the very first time. The music was filling the entire hall with a sound no one had ever encountered before, and the audience could barely contain their own reaction. But the man standing on that stage, the man who had written every single note of what was being played, could not hear any of it. Not a single note. In complete silence, he was moving his hands in time with a symphony that existed only inside his own mind. When the final note sounded, the audience rose to their feet. Applause, cheering, handkerchiefs and hats waving through the air. But Beethoven was still facing away from them, still moving, still lost inside the music no one else could give him. One of the soloists gently took hold of his sleeve and guided him to turn around. He turned. And he saw it. He saw the entire city of Vienna standing and applauding. He saw people with tears running down their faces. He saw mouths open in shouts he would never be able to hear. He could see it all. But he heard none of it. That image gives me chills every single time I think about it. Is it tragedy? Is it triumph? Both of those things seem to exist in that single frozen moment at the same time. A man who used deaf ears to create the greatest sound in human history, standing in silence, receiving a glory he could never truly hear. To understand why that moment is so staggering, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to 1770. Beethoven was born in December of 1770, in Bonn, Germany. At that time, Bonn was the seat of the Elector of Cologne, a city with culture, aristocratic energy, and a strong musical tradition. His family lived near the Rhine River in a modest home that was never quite comfortable enough. There was a father, a mother, and several siblings. On the surface, this looked like an ordinary household of working musicians. His father Johann was a court singer, a tenor employed by the court chapel. To put it more plainly, Johann was a man of some musical talent who drank far too much and channeled his unfulfilled ambitions in harmful directions. His own career had stalled at a middling level with no path upward, and that frustration had nowhere productive to go. But then he noticed something about his son Ludwig. The boy had an unusual sensitivity to melody and sound that went beyond anything ordinary. Johann had heard the story of Mozart, the child prodigy who could compose at age 5, whose father became celebrated alongside him. Something ignited in Johann. He decided he would turn this son into a prodigy too. And so little Ludwig grew up between the piano keys and his own private fear. His father would sometimes pull him from sleep in the middle of the night to practice. If his playing fell short, there were consequences. Real ones. Formal training began at age 5. By age 7 he was giving public performances. The poster for that first concert listed his age as 6. Johann had shaved off a year to make the child appear even more like a miracle. That detail stays with me every time I read about it. A child who has no ability to refuse, already being pressed forward by someone else's dream. But stories are never only one-sided. It was precisely that pressure that began forming something inside Beethoven. An ability to not collapse under weight. A habit of continuing even when continuing was painful. He did not play out of joy at first. He played because the alternative was worse. But slowly and steadily, he fell in love with music on his own terms. That love was his alone. He had taken it quietly from the middle of his father's pressure and held it close, making it his own. At age 11 he became the assistant court organist at the court theater. For an 11-year-old, that was already a remarkable achievement. At 13 he was playing harpsichord in the court orchestra. His performance style was already starting to carry something distinctive. Not the kind of distinctiveness that made people say how polished and refined it sounded. The kind that made people feel unsettled, that left them unable to find the right words after. He was also beginning to compose his own works during these years. His earliest published compositions appeared when he was around 12 years old. Piano pieces, variations, works that showed a young hand still developing but already reaching for something beyond ordinary imitation. Christian Gottlieb Niffy, who became his most important early teacher in Bonn, recognized that this was not simply a talented student who needed to be trained properly. This was someone who needed room to grow in his own direction. Niffy wrote about Beethoven at this time in terms that made clear he believed something genuinely unusual was present. At 17, he had the opportunity to travel to Vienna for the first time. Vienna in 1787 was electric with musical energy and aristocratic patronage. Haydn was at the height of his powers. Mozart was producing some of the finest work of his entire life. For a young musician arriving from a provincial German city, stepping into Vienna must have felt like suddenly standing at the center of the world. Whether he actually met Mozart during this trip is uncertain and historically debated. But the story that has been passed down through generations says that Mozart, after hearing the young Beethoven improvise at the keyboard, turned to those around him and said something to the effect of, "Remember this young man, because one day the world will hear from him." Whether that account was shaped and polished over time or captures something that genuinely happened, it conveys something true. Even the greatest figure of that era could feel the uncommon weight of what this young man carried inside him. His first Vienna trip did not last long. News came that his mother was gravely ill. He rushed back to Bonn and arrived in time to watch her die. After that, his father sank even deeper into drinking and became incapable of managing the household. Beethoven, still a teenager, became the one responsible for holding everything together. He supported his two younger brothers. He managed the finances. He kept things running during the days when his father was completely unable to function. This was his first real, head-on collision with the full weight of actual life. That collision was not gentle. In 1792, at the age of 22, he made his second journey to Vienna. This time it was intentional and purposeful. He was going to study under Haydn, to put down roots in the city, and to become the person he knew he needed to become. Vienna at that time was the undisputed musical capital of Europe. The finest composers, the most demanding audiences, the richest musical environment anywhere on the continent, all concentrated in one place. Beethoven understood. If he was going to fight, this was the battlefield where it had to happen. He arrived with letters of introduction from important patrons back in Bonn and with a small stipend to support him in the early months. He arrived also with the consuming awareness that he had left something unfinished in himself, some musical statement that had not yet been made, and that making it was the only thing he had come here to do. He was not modest about his ambitions. He rarely was. His time studying with Haydn did not go entirely smoothly. The two men were fundamentally different in character. Haydn was gracious, orderly, and attentive to form and social convention. Beethoven was rough-edged, blunt, and incapable of concealing what he actually thought. He found Haydn too conservative and sought additional lessons from other teachers on the side without telling him. When Haydn eventually found out, he did not erupt in anger. because he could see clearly enough that this student was not the kind who could be contained by a conventional approach. Haydn later spoke of Beethoven with genuine admiration, even as he acknowledged that the young man was, to put it charitably, not the easiest person to teach. The relationship between them remained complicated but never entirely hostile. Each recognized in the other someone who took the work seriously, which was ultimately the thing that mattered most. Beethoven built a reputation in Vienna remarkably quickly. But it was not the kind of reputation that made people praise his technical polish. It was the kind that left people uncertain about what they had experienced but completely unable to forget it. The force of his touch at the keyboard, the range of his dynamics, the raw energy that moved through every performance, all of it cut sharply against the fashions of the era. The period valued elegance, balance, and restraint. Beethoven brought something entirely different. Something that felt as if it might actually break the instrument he was sitting at. The famous story that circulated about him was that he could reduce people to tears in the middle of a salon performance. Not because the music was sad in a conventional way, but because something happened in the room when he played that made people feel exposed, as if he had reached inside them and found something they had not offered him. That was an unusual power for a young man to possess, and Vienna noticed it immediately. He also made a name for himself through improvisation. In that era, the ability to improvise at the keyboard in front of a live audience was a mark of the highest musical intelligence. It was not simply a matter of playing fluently on themes that were suggested. It required being able to think in real time at the highest level, building structures spontaneously that held together as music while also responding to the mood of the room. Beethoven in improvisation was said to be something that could not be described to someone who had not witnessed it. There are accounts of other accomplished pianists who came to Vienna specifically hoping to defeat him in one of the informal competitions that sometimes took place between visiting virtuosos. Most of those encounters ended the same way. He soon attracted the attention and financial support of the aristocracy. Prince Lichnowsky became one of his most important patrons, offering him lodging inside the palace itself. Several other nobles supported him financially so he could focus on composition without constant worry. Beethoven needed that support. But he was never the kind of artist who expressed gratitude in conventional ways. One of his most famous conflicts with Lichnowsky came when the prince demanded that he perform for visiting French military officers. Beethoven refused. A furious argument followed. Beethoven reportedly said something along these lines: "A prince becomes a prince because of the family he was born into. What I have become, I became through my own work and effort. There are many princes in this world, but there is only one of me." Then he moved out of the palace. That pride could make him seem impossible to be around. But it was the same pride that prevented him from compromising in his creative work. He refused to write music that simply made aristocratic ears comfortable while carrying no real substance. He wanted to write things that actually had weight. And then, while he was at the peak of his creative energy, something terrible began approaching quietly. Sometime between his mid-20s and late 20s, Beethoven started noticing that something was wrong. His ears were not functioning the way they should. It started as a ringing. Then high-pitched sounds grew blurry and indistinct. His overall hearing continued to decline steadily after that. He consulted many doctors. None could give him a clear diagnosis or effective treatment. He tried every available remedy: spa treatments in the countryside, various herbal preparations, different fashionable cures of the era. Nothing worked. For a composer, the loss of hearing is the most brutal deprivation you can imagine. Beethoven could not accept it. He began withdrawing from social situations because he was terrified of people discovering the truth. If someone spoke to him from across a room and he failed to respond, they might mistake his silence for arrogance. He could not explain, because explaining meant admitting. In public he maintained the performance of normalcy. Privately he was living in something that resembled a kind of hell. He became increasingly irritable, suspicious, and difficult to be around during this period. People who knew him noticed the change but could not fully understand it. He pushed away friends who had been close to him. He ended relationships and then mourned their ending. He developed a growing tendency to suspect people of taking advantage of him or misrepresenting him, a paranoia that would deepen as the years went on. Some of this was his natural temperament amplified. Some of it was almost certainly the psychological weight of the secret he was carrying. When you cannot hear the world properly but cannot tell anyone that is happening, the world begins to feel like something happening behind glass. Visible but unreachable. In 1802, while staying in the village of Heiligenstadt to rest and try to recover, he wrote a letter addressed to his two brothers. That letter has come to be known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In it, he described the impossibility of his situation, the social isolation, the humiliation of what he was experiencing, the depth of what he was losing. He said he had come very close to ending his own life. Only art had stopped him. He wrote that he could not leave the world before he had given it everything he felt was still inside him waiting to be expressed. He also wrote that he felt he had barely begun. He wrote the letter and then never sent it. He folded it away, put it somewhere private, and continued walking forward alone. He was 32 years old at the time. The Heiligenstadt Testament is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of music. Not because it reveals hidden secrets about his compositions, but because it shows us a man at the edge, staring into the abyss, and choosing to step back. The reason he stepped back was not hope in a conventional sense. It was something more like obligation to the work he had not yet done. That is a particular kind of courage, the courage not of someone who believes everything will be fine, but of someone who keeps moving precisely because they cannot afford to stop. In the years that followed, he continued to compose. And what he composed became increasingly extraordinary. The Third Symphony, completed in 1804 and later known as the Eroica, marked a decisive turning point in the history of the symphonic form. Before it, symphonies ran perhaps 25 minutes and operated within clearly understood conventions of elegance and structural balance. The Eroica ran nearly an hour. Its emotional range, its structural complexity, its sheer scale of ambition, all of it far exceeded what audiences had been prepared to encounter. At the premiere, some people were overwhelmed and deeply moved. Others walked out. Some said it was too long. Some said it was too loud. Some said it was simply too difficult. But others said they had never heard anything remotely like it in their lives. What Beethoven had done with the Eroica was essentially to change the rules. He had taken a form that was understood as a vehicle for elegant entertainment and transformed it into something capable of carrying the weight of genuine philosophical content. The symphony was no longer a pleasant diversion. It was a statement. It was an argument. It was something that demanded a response from its audience. That transformation did not happen gradually or by committee. It happened because one man decided the form could hold more than anyone had previously asked it to hold, and then he forced it to do so. The symphony had originally been dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte. Beethoven had admired Napoleon deeply, seeing in him a figure who embodied revolutionary ideals of freedom, equality, and the breaking of the old order. But when news arrived that Napoleon had declared himself emperor, Beethoven was furious. He reportedly tore the dedication page out of the score. He said something to the effect that Napoleon had revealed himself to be merely an ordinary man after all, one willing to crush human rights underfoot just to satisfy his own ambition. The symphony was rededicated to the memory of a great man, becoming an elegy not for any specific individual but for the very idea of heroism itself. That rededication is itself a kind of statement about how Beethoven understood his own work. The music was never really about a person. It was about what a person could represent. The Fifth Symphony premiered in 1808. That opening, 4 notes, 3 short and 1 long, is one of the most recognized sequences of sound in all of human civilization. Beethoven is often quoted as describing it as fate knocking at the door. Whether those were his exact words or something attributed to him later, those 4 notes communicate something unmistakable. They carry an unrelenting tension, a force that refuses to yield under pressure. The entire first movement is built around the idea of something that will not stop, that keeps returning, that cannot be outrun. By the 4th movement, something has shifted. The tension has been transformed into something different, not resolved in the sense of being defeated, but metabolized into a kind of forward momentum that feels entirely unlike the darkness of the opening. That arc, from the oppressive knocking of the first movement to the exhilaration of the finale, is Beethoven telling you something directly about his own understanding of what it means to face difficulty and keep moving. That same year also saw the premiere of his 6th Symphony, titled The Pastoral. That work could not have felt more different from the 5th. It was gentle, quiet, saturated with the feeling of the natural world. Beethoven loved walking through the countryside. He said nature gave him inspiration and a kind of mental clarity unavailable to him in the city. Some have suggested that as his external hearing faded, what he received from nature became something he perceived through an entirely different kind of sensitivity. His hearing continued to decline. By around age 40, he was almost entirely deaf. He began communicating through small notebooks, handing them to visitors so they could write what they wanted to say to him. Those notebooks were preserved. Scholars call them the conversation books. Historians have used them to reconstruct something of what his daily life looked like in his final years. He reportedly tried resting a wooden rod against the resonating body of a piano and biting the other end, using bone conduction to feel vibrations that his ears could no longer transmit. He also had the legs of his piano removed so it could rest directly on the floor, allowing him to press against it and feel the sound moving through the wood. That image, every time I return to it, carries a kind of heartbreaking grandeur. He was using every remaining sense he had to hold on to music that was slipping away from him. But he never stopped composing. And some have argued that once he was fully deaf, his compositions entered a state of creative freedom unlike anything he had produced before. Without the interference of the external sonic world, every note existed only inside his interior imagination. That is a state of pure creation that is almost impossible to describe and that no other path could have produced. The works he created during this late period of his life reach into places that the music of his era had no real framework for. His last 5 piano sonatas moved through states of feeling that seemed to belong to no particular emotional category. His late string quartets, particularly those written in the final years before his death, have confounded and fascinated musicians and listeners for 2 centuries. They are not simply difficult to perform. They are difficult to fully understand even after decades of devoted attention. There is something in them that feels as if it arrived from a consciousness that had stripped away every pretension and was simply saying what it had to say with complete and almost terrifying directness. Some historians of music have observed that Beethoven in his late work was inventing forms and approaches that the wider world of composition would not fully understand or embrace until many decades after his death. He was writing music that was ahead of the very tradition that had produced him. And he was doing it alone, in silence, in a room where no external sound could reach him. In 1817, he began seriously working toward the Ninth Symphony. The idea had been living in his mind for many years before that. He had long imagined incorporating a full chorus of voices into a symphony's final movement, using words from a poem by the German poet Schiller. But bringing that vision from imagination into finished notation required years of work, countless revisions, and sustained concentration that his deteriorating physical condition made enormously demanding. He filled enormous quantities of sketchbooks with ideas, fragments, rejected possibilities, and gradual refinements. Those sketchbooks survive, and scholars have studied them intensively to understand how his creative process worked. What they reveal is a process of staggering effort and patience. A man who was willing to circle an idea 100 times until it became exactly what he needed it to be. The project consumed nearly 7 years of his life. On May 7 of 1824, the Ninth Symphony received its premiere in Vienna. What happened that evening has become one of the most described moments in the entire history of composed music. Beethoven stood on stage, positioned beside the actual conductor. He was not technically conducting the performance because he could not hear it. But he had insisted on being present on stage, turning the pages of the score and moving his body in time with the music as it existed in his memory. His movements sometimes fell out of sync with the actual performance, because what he was following was the version that lived only inside his own mind. Think about what that experience must have been like for the musicians on stage around him. They were performing one of the most demanding pieces of music anyone had ever attempted to write. And standing among them, at the center of everything, was the composer himself, profoundly deaf, moving in a rhythm only he could perceive, unreachable by the sound that was filling the hall around him. The 4th movement began, and the chorus of voices joined the orchestra for the first time in symphonic history. The words drawn from Schiller's poem speak, in essence, of joy as a force that connects all human beings to one another, of brotherhood, of the light that exists on the other side of darkness. The idea that suffering does not have the final word. The idea that human beings, despite everything, can still reach towards something larger than themselves. The man who had written every note of what was being performed and sung could hear none of it. Not a single word. Not a single phrase of the music he had spent 7 years building in the silence of his own mind. The symphony ended. The audience erupted. But Beethoven was still facing the orchestra, still turning pages, because he had not heard the ending. He did not know the performance had stopped. One of the soloists, a young soprano named Caroline Unger, gently reached for his sleeve and guided him around to face the audience. He turned. And he saw the entire audience of Vienna on their feet. He saw handkerchiefs waving in the air. He saw hats raised high above the crowd. He saw faces wet with tears. He saw mouths open in cheers and shouts that were loud enough to shake the walls, but that reached him in total silence. He saw all of it. And he heard none of it. It is recorded that he wept. I do not know what was moving through his mind in that moment. No one does. but I imagine it may have been the most complex feeling a human being is capable of experiencing. The feeling of having waited an entire lifetime, spent every last resource, sacrificed nearly everything, just to stand in that particular place. And then arriving there, seeing everything you had hoped to see, but not being able to hear the sound of it. The Ninth Symphony went on to become something that transcended the category of a musical composition entirely. Its fourth movement, that choral finale built around Schiller's text, was adopted as the official anthem of the European Union. A recording was loaded onto the Voyager Golden Record and sent into deep space, so that even the cosmos might have a chance to encounter it. It is performed at major occasions across the world as an expression of humanity's highest aspirations, for peace, for human connection, for joy that has been genuinely earned through suffering. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, one of the first things that happened was that Leonard Bernstein conducted the Ninth Symphony to mark the occasion. When humanity wants to say something important about itself, this is one of the works it reaches for. But all of that came later. On the night of that premiere, the man standing on stage with his back to the applause was simply a deaf composer completing in silence the most important task of his life. There is more to say about Beethoven the person, not only Beethoven the composer. He never married. He fell in love several times over the course of his life, and none of those connections found a lasting place. Some historians argue that his temperament made sustained intimacy nearly impossible to maintain over time. Others point to the complications of social class, the chaos of his circumstances, the very real possibility that he simply had never learned how to remain inside a close relationship without eventually damaging it. The truth is probably some combination of all of those things, mixed together in proportions that varied depending on the particular person and the particular moment. After his death, a letter was found among his private belongings. It was addressed to a woman he called the immortal beloved. The letter had never been sent. It was found folded and stored where no one could see it, alongside the Heiligenstadt Testament, also never sent. Its contents are deeply personal, filled with longing, passion, and a kind of ache that feels almost too intimate to read. Scholars have spent nearly 2 centuries debating the identity of that woman, proposing various candidates, building elaborate arguments around dates and geography and correspondence, and never arriving at a conclusion everyone accepts. Perhaps that mystery is simply part of who he was. Some questions were never meant to be fully answered. He took guardianship of his nephew Karl, the son of his deceased brother Caspar. He tried to inhabit the role of a father figure, but the relationship became deeply and painfully complicated. His need for control over the boy was intense, even obsessive. He fought prolonged and exhausting legal battles with Karl's mother over custody and the right to shape the boy's upbringing. He allowed Karl very little space to become his own person, and Karl felt the weight of that lack of space every day. Karl eventually attempted to take his own life. He survived, but the incident left Beethoven deeply and visibly shaken. Something about watching that happen to the person he had tried so hard to protect seems to have reached him in a way that ordinary misfortune had stopped being able to do. Perhaps what it showed him was the limit of what force of will can accomplish when applied to another human being. Perhaps he never fully learned how to love someone without holding them too tightly. His health in his later years was poor in multiple respects. Beyond the complete loss of hearing, his liver was severely damaged, very likely worsened by decades of drinking, and his digestive system caused him chronic and sometimes debilitating difficulty. He was not always an easy patient and not always willing to follow the guidance of the doctors who tried to help him. But he kept working. He kept writing. He pushed forward until his body simply would not allow him to continue any further. On March 26, 1827, Beethoven died in Vienna at the age of 56. Historical accounts note that a powerful thunderstorm passed over the city that afternoon. There are records of lightning crossing the Vienna sky at the time of his death. That image feels fitting somehow. He had always been a storm of a person. His funeral reportedly drew more than 20,000 citizens of Vienna into the streets. The composer Franz Schubert, who had long admired Beethoven from a respectful distance, was among those who walked in that procession. Vienna understood. They had lost someone who could not be made again. Beethoven left behind a body of work of staggering scale and depth. 9 symphonies, each one a landmark in the history of the form. 5 piano concertos, with the 5th known as the Emperor standing as one of the absolute peaks of the entire concerto repertoire. 1 violin concerto, which remains among the most significant works ever written for that instrument. 32 piano sonatas, including the Moonlight Sonata, the Pathétique, and the Appassionata, works that generations of pianists have spent entire careers trying to understand and communicate. 16-string quartets, the late ones in particular so deep and so strange that musicians and listeners have spent lifetimes trying to fully enter them. His only opera, Fidelio, his Missa Solemnis, and an enormous catalogue of additional works. None of these are simply collections of notes arranged on paper. Each one carries the mark of a person in ongoing struggle with something enormous. Each one holds evidence of someone who, even in the darkest circumstances, refused to stop trying to say something true. Beethoven's story endures not only because of his extraordinary talent. Talent exists throughout history. Every era has its gifted individuals. His story endures because he continued when he had the most compelling reasons to stop. Because fate stripped away from him the very thing that should have made his work impossible. And his response was to create the greatest work of his life. If today is a day when life has delivered a particularly heavy blow, if you are in one of those valleys where the path forward is not yet visible, think of that man standing on a stage with his back to the applause. He did not quit. He did not continue because conditions were favorable. Conditions were not favorable. He continued because stopping was something he had decided not to do. Think about what he left behind. 9 symphonies, each one a landmark that changed what came after it. 5 piano concertos, with the 5th, known as the Emperor, standing as one of the absolute peaks of the entire concerto repertoire even now, 2 centuries later. 1 violin concerto, which remains among the most significant ever written for that instrument. 32 piano sonatas, including the Moonlight Sonata, the Pathétique, and the Appassionata, works that generations of pianists have spent entire careers trying to understand and communicate. 16-string quartets, the late ones in particular so deep and so strange that musicians and listeners have devoted lifetimes to trying to fully enter them. His only opera, titled Fidelio, his Missa Solemnis, and an enormous catalogue of additional chamber music, songs, and orchestral works. Each piece in that catalogue carries the mark of a person in ongoing struggle with something enormous. Each one holds the evidence of someone who, even in the most unforgiving circumstances, refused to stop reaching for the truth of what he heard inside himself. And consider the influence. Brahms, who came after him, was so intimidated by the legacy of the 9 symphonies that he spent decades working up the courage to write his first symphony, finally completing it at the age of 43. Wagner built an entire philosophy of musical drama partly in response to and partly in conversation with what Beethoven had done with the symphonic form. Mahler, Bruckner, Shostakovich, Bartók, all of the great composers who came in the century and a half after Beethoven were working in a world that his music had fundamentally reshaped. The influence did not stay inside the world of composed music either. Pop musicians have quoted and sampled and reimagined Beethoven. Filmmakers use his work to reach for emotional registers that language cannot easily access. His music appears in advertisements, in wedding ceremonies, at state funerals, at celebrations of New Year's and new beginnings. Some music exists at the level of ordinary culture and ordinary time. Beethoven's music exists at a different level, the level at which humans mark the things that genuinely matter. That is Beethoven. That is what the 5th Symphony is really saying. Not that fate is knocking at the door, but that he was knocking at fate's door. Knocking until fate moved out of the way. Thank you so much for being here with me today on Thinker J. We paid tribute to this extraordinary figure in the history of human creativity. See you next time.